Hello and welcome to Strait Talk. I'm Aisha Subarkash. It's an unenviable title. From 2014 to 2018, Saudi Arabia was the world's largest arms importer. The kingdom also spent more money on its military in 2018 than any other country, except for the US and China, $67 billion. And that's for a nation of just 34 million people. Most of those weapons came from the same countries that have criticized Saudi Arabia's 5-year campaign in Yemen. To transport much of that military hardware, Riyadh has relied on a cargo ship called the Bahri Yanbu. When it stopped at ports in Europe earlier this month, it was greeted by protests and lawsuits. Let's take a look at this report.
De toutes nos armes ayant servi
And joining me now is Holly Topham, an editor at the Sana Center for Strategic Studies. She also co-authors the monthly publication, The Yemen Review, and by Marvin, the Director of Policy Studies at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, which is based in Doha, Qatar. Holly, Marvin, thank you for joining me on Strait Talk. So, as we saw on the report, most of the countries protesting against this Saudi cargo ship, which is suspected of carrying weapons into the Yemen war, are actually the countries which export most of their arms to the Saudi kingdom. Tell us about the dilemma here, and is Saudi Arabia too lucrative to abandon?
So it's very interesting if we consider these protests in light of the bigger picture around arms sales to Saudi Arabia. There's been a lot of change in Europe over this. Back in 2016, we saw a number of countries halt exports, but the real shift really came after the killing of Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. And straight after that, Germany halted arms exports. And over in the US, we saw a wave of political pressure, including from within President Trump's own party. And last year in the UK, we saw a landmark ruling that found that the UK government acted unlawfully in allowing certain weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. So we really do seem to be seeing a sort of groundswell of public opinion calling for greater scrutiny of these sales. And what's quite interesting, I find, is that this used to be kind of the purview of just activist groups and, you know, very narrow, like issue-focused lobbying groups. We're seeing more voices joining this now, a wider chorus, and that's sort of a shift that is very interesting.
So Marvin, do you think, I mean, will this latest round of protests, as just Holly mentioned, in your opinion, have an impact on Saudi policies in the coming future? And if not, what else could change Saudi Arabia's
I don't think it will have real impact on the Saudi foreign policy.
But what else could have?
Well, because Saudi Arabia is not very much, I mean, they are dealing mainly with governments rather than people. And there is a clear gap between what people think about Saudi Arabia and what governments think about Saudi Arabia. People might care more about human rights violations in Yemen and elsewhere. Governments are mainly looking after their own national interests. This is the gap, actually, that has always been there in Western societies. Saudi Arabia is actually, as we all know, has the third largest defense budget in the world. It comes only after the United States and China.
Yes.
It comes even before Russia. In 2015, for example, they spent more than $87 billion on
we're going to get
defense.
into that, yes.
So Saudi Arabia is very important, actually, customer for the big arms companies.
So too lucrative to abandon.
I think, yes, absolutely. And the Saudis, they understand that position very well. Plus, most Western countries actually believe that if we don't sell Saudi Arabia arms, somebody else will sell them. Now we can see that Russia and China are becoming, if you go to the SIPRI report, for example, the latest SIPRI report, the Stockholm Institute for Peace.
But isn't it all against the Europeans' core values of human rights?
I don't see that values are playing key role, actually, in the foreign policies of the Western countries, generally speaking. I think they care more about the economy is the most important issue for them, and the arms industry is very important element of this economic and commercial interest.
Holly, do you agree with Marvin that there's a great gap between people and the governments? Do you believe if these protests continue to grow by individuals or NGOs, that would eventually force the governments to revisit their arms deals with Saudi Arabia?
I think the pressure point is certainly with the national governments that are exporting the arms rather than Saudi Arabia. But I would say that there is some pressure to be bought. We have seen it in the past. In 2016, the Obama administration halted exports of precision-guided missiles following the funeral strike that killed 140 people. So I don't think we should be too fatalistic in this matter. I think there is pressure to be bought. And I think that is a direction of the shift we're seeing. Of course, as Marwan said, there is deep strategic alliances, economic relationships underpinning all of this. It isn't going to change overnight, but I think there is
just a start, maybe. So if you will, let's take a look at some recent statistics on this multi-billion dollars arms deals between Saudi Arabia and some Western countries. So Saudi Arabia, after the United States and China, has the third largest military budget in 2018, totaling $67.6 billion. It is also the largest arms importer in the world. Between 2014 and 2018, Riyadh spent $16.8 billion on arms. And during that time, a majority of its weapons came from 5 countries. 68% of its arms came from the US, totaling $11.5 billion. The UK, with a 16% share, sold weapons worth $2.7 billion, and France, with a share of 4%, sold weapons worth $733 million. So Marwan, what do you think Saudi Arabia, a country relatively with a small population of 34 million, needs to spend so much on defense? Is it really necessary?
We have to talk about 2 things here. On the one hand, about the threat perceptions that are actually seen by the Saudis, because they think that they want to challenge Iran, they want to actually protect their interest in Yemen and in many other places. But this is not the whole story. The story also has another face, which is political mainly. Saudi Arabia, by spending too much money on arms from Western countries, they are buying influence. This is what not only Saudi Arabia, but so many Gulf countries actually, they are spending money on weapons that they are never going to use, in fact. But what they are doing, in fact, is by spending too much money on weapons, they are, as I said, buying political influence in these countries. This is what Saudi Arabia is doing, and what
because we see Saudi Arabia failing and deterring any attacks from Iran or Yemeni Houthi fighters.
If we look at the record of Saudi Arabia in terms of military accomplishment, it's not that good. In fact, we have seen it failing in Yemen. We have seen actually it failing in Syria and in other places. So, as I said, it's not about military accomplishment. It's not about weapons that
just
they really
political
need.
influence
It's
to
about
exert on
buying
those
political
countries.
influence in the West.
Holly, quickly, give us a sense of a European vision, especially when it comes to living up to their international obligations, like the Arms Trade Treaty, which was once championed by France. Why do you think some countries have chosen to act on their own?
I think the issue with EU export control regimes is that it's one of the areas that falls into an issue of national sovereignty as opposed to a EU framework. So even though we have the Arms Trade Treaty, the common export control, these issues generally are made at a member state level. Even though they're binding, there's not really any mechanisms to enforce them.
Okay. And are such breaches very hard to prove?
They're hard to prove. The wording in them often is fairly subjective. So they're based around this idea of assessing whether there's a clear risk. The issue there is who decides what a clear risk of civilian harm is. It's a very subjective issue. And as I said, is not really enforceable.
Yeah. Marvin, tell us about the latest on Yemen. And the Saudi-led coalition fighting in Yemen has just said it has begun judicial proceedings against military personnel suspected of violating international humanitarian law. What do you make of that decision?
I think I wouldn't take that seriously.
Is it a face-saving decision?
I mean, you can say that, and you can also say that Saudi Arabia may be trying actually to use this as one way in order to I know Saudi Arabia is becoming under huge media scrutiny in the West because of these human rights violations, especially in Yemen. And by trying actually to have these judicial proceedings against certain officers, I think they are trying to clean their record. It's more than something systematic in order to stop the violations of human rights in Yemen. It's more, as I said, it's about cleaning the record in front of this public opinion.
All right. I'm afraid we're out of time. Holly, Marwan, thank you very much for joining me on Strait Talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.